Ray Dalio yesterday said he's worried about something worse than a recession, his words. What he meant was an economic downturn, which is bad enough, but one that's combined with a monetary event. When you add the latter to the former, that's where you go from something like a 2001 mild recession to 2008 or something similar on that level. It isn't stocks which make that difference either. After all, there was a slow motion crash in them from 2000 to 2003 with only the mildest recession on record as a consequence. 5 years later, however, the monetary system goes deflationary and the entire economy breaks down. That's the whole difference. Deflation is the thing, and in his own way, that's what Dalio is talking about. What's happening in the Treasury market is potentially a warning, especially since this is the second time in 4 months. Everyone missed the first time thinking that rising yields back in December and January were about inflation or the Fed or something. There are other preliminary signs out there too for monetary deflation, which is what makes this a particularly difficult period. To start with, the economy is far weaker than everyone has said. That's what the stock market is actually reacting to. The abrupt realization that full-scale recession risks are far higher than anyone had imagined before recently. And incoming data keeps confirming it too. Today we got the Federal Reserve survey of consumers, which reported that consumers' greatest fear is, by far, layoffs. The series mean probability forecast for the unemployment rate was the third highest on record. Americans are drastically worried about their jobs and their incomes, which aligns with far too many other facts that we have to take this seriously. But Dalio is right about the one thing, is if we haven't all figured this out already, given the volatility of the past few weeks, we need to be vigilant about recession risk separately, then the monetary risk, which might then amplify all the nastier aspects of the recession, as well as create additional consequences beside. Only those other consequences aren't going to be what Dalio has in mind. He's talking about interest rates in the blow up in the Treasury market, which is in the right area, looking at the symptoms rather than the cause. Where it comes to interest rates, we know where they're going to go because we have any number of signals that tell us deflationary risks are everywhere, from swap spreads that absolutely plunged to something like copper to gold, which did the same thing recently too. Deflationary signals, money deflationary signals. And that combined with recession, that's where you get the worst economic case. So Dalio is right to begin worrying about all of these things coming together, if not quite right about what they all mean and what those signals are for them. But what he said yesterday on NBC's Meet the Press was, right now we're at a decision-making point and very close to a recession. And I'm worried about something worse than a recession if this isn't handled well. He then recommended that Congress should reduce the federal deficit to 3% of gross domestic product, and echoing comments that he made in another event in March. If they don't, Dalio said, we're going to have a supply-demand problem for debt at the same time as we have these other problems, talking about economic problems, and the result of that will be worse than a normal recession. The very value of money is at stake, Dalio said. A breakdown in the bond market, combined with events like internal and international conflict, could be even more severe of a shock to the monetary system than President Richard Nixon's cancellation of the gold standard in 1971 and the global financial crisis in 2008. And he's got set aside the Nixon thing for a second, because the Nixon closing the gold window was basically an arbitrary symbolic event at the end of the Eurodollar takeover rather than some monetary disruption. The monetary disruption happened more than a decade before 1971. That was just politicians finally recognizing that it had taken place and having no real explanation for it. What Dalio's really saying here is that we're seeing problems in the Treasury market, and we know that the implications of that are not going to be good. Now, he thinks it means higher interest rates and the risk that, there won't be anybody to buy U.S. Treasuries, so interest rates are going to go up. And we see all these other signals around the financial marketplace of the reason why Treasury rates have gone up over the last couple of weeks, which is deflationary symptoms, deflationary money. We see those everywhere. Interest rate swap spreads, as I noted in a video recently. The rising dollar, it's not weak, the dollar is too high, which is another sign of potentially deflationary money, and several others besides. So the risk isn't that the Treasury market won't have enough buyers for its debt. The problem is, in the Treasury market specifically, there's too many sellers. And why are there too many sellers? Because of the deflationary money. And because there's deflationary money problems in the repo market and other wholesale markets beside, that raises the chances that a regular garden variety recession gets nudged into the wrong category, or gets shoved into the wrong category of something not a rerun of 2008, but on that level of seriousness, that level of contraction, that level of danger and damage in the real economy. We've seen this before, as I mentioned in that recent video. In 2008, rates went up during the worst of the crisis. Hardly anyone remembers because of the meltdown in the stock market, meltdown in the economy, and because the Fed came along with its QEs. But after rates rose in October 2008, where did they go after that? They plunged, and then they soared in 2009, not because people weren't buying treasuries or they're worried about the ARRA and the stimulus bill and government deficits. Interest rates rose like we wanted them to because the market was relatively less pessimistic and a little bit more optimistic about reflation. And then they went lower over the next decade after we got the second crisis in 2010 and 2011. So even as debt issuance had absolutely soared throughout the 2010s, the price of government debt went only higher and higher and higher. We wish it wasn't the case, but that's deflationary economics. And then again in 2020, rates did the same thing during the meltdown when the dollar shortage was at its worst. Foreign reserve managers were selling their U.S. treasuries, forcing basis traders to do the same thing as it all clogged up the repo market. And then after rates went up, they went plunging back down again. By the summer of 2020, where were interest rates? Interest rates were at record lows. Long-term treasury rates were at record lows. And then over the next year and a half, treasury rates only went up modestly based on reflationary conditions after the pandemic and the lockdowns. And it only went really higher once the Federal Reserve got involved with rate hikes, fearing inflation risks that weren't actually there, misreading the supply shock situation. So we never had a problem after treasury selling because the treasury selling was based on the dollar shortage, the acute dollar shortages that erupted in 2008 as well as 2020. It's the dollar shortage you have to be worried about, not the selling in U.S. treasuries. It's not an interest rate story. It's a monetary story. But Dalio's not the only one thinking about this. I mean, practically everyone on Wall Street and even the mainstream media. I mean, like Dalio was on Meet the Press, a mainstream media outlet, Sunday morning show. Lots of people are talking about the rise in treasury yields, but none of them are mentioning the repo market or breakdowns in wholesale money. Even the Treasury Secretary, last week he was on Fox Business talking about what to do about the sell-off in U.S. Treasuries. And the sell-off in U.S. Treasuries when he was on Fox Business was having one of its worst days. What he told Maria Bartiromo was part of the deregulation that's coming in the banking industry will be changing what's called the supplementary leverage ratio, which will allow banks to buy more treasuries without a big capital charge. So I'd expect that we will create a new buyer for treasury securities, a larger, more durable buyer. And he's, again, thinking about this the wrong way. Why are they selling in the first place? Not what do we do once the selling starts? And now the idea that the SLR and regulations are holding back the banking sector, and specifically dealer banks, is something that we hear quite a lot from academic researchers as well as bankers themselves, and bankers hate regulations. But it has nothing to do with regulations. When you can't see the dollar shortage because you're always looking at the Fed, and the Fed makes everybody think that the dollar system is fine, that it's got everything covered, you start looking in all these other different directions rather than where you actually need to be focused on. So rather than saying, why are people selling treasuries the way that they are, instead we're saying, okay, what do we do about the treasuries once they're being sold? That's what the Fed is. The Fed's a janitor that comes in and cleans everything up. That's what the government is looking at and looking into as well. But the SLR, that's not going to change anything. After all, I just did a video recently on the banking sector in Europe. The banks in Europe are certainly subject to the SLR, just like American banks are, and they have had zero problem buying European sovereign debt. As I pointed out in that video, the amount of government bonds that they've been buying over the last year, but in the last couple of months, January and February specifically, has been near historic. So the problem isn't banks aren't buying government debt. It's specifically U.S. treasuries are being sold. And nobody wants to talk about why they're being sold. And Ray Dalio, who's not talking about that either, at least sees the symptoms of it and realizes that there are negative consequences. When you put together deflationary money with an economic recession, that's where you get to the worst cases. If only they would see the cause of that second part of it. The recession risks are going up anyway, but you see the cause of the second part of it and realize the chances are rising for both the recession as well as potentially a deflationary component to it. It's not capital ratios. It's not the supplementary leverage ratio. It's not Basel at all. Again, we got to think about the consequences of a breakdown in liquidity, therefore repo markets, wholesale markets, deflationary money as recession risks, traditional full-scale, full-blown recession risks are indeed rising, and rising in a way basically everyone can see it, at least everyone who's being honest about this. So the real risk here is the dollar shortage, not higher interest rates. Everything that we have says that interest rates are very much far more likely to go lower than they are to go higher. It's the same thing when people are saying the dollar's weak. The dollar isn't weak. Where the dollar is weak against certain currencies like Swiss franc or the euro being volatile there, or even the Japanese yen, that's another sign of dollar difficulties in the world, deflationary money. I mentioned swap spreads. Interest rate swap spreads last week absolutely plunged. And one reason why was because as treasury yields were rising due to this deflationary interruption in the repo market, as interest rates were rising in nominal treasury, swap rates didn't really move. So swap spreads absolutely exploded. And what that meant was the market is not expecting rates to go up. Rates are not the problem. Deflationary money is the problem. That's the verdict from the swap market. Same thing with something like copper to gold, which is an inflation versus deflation, broadly speaking, indicator. While gold was soaring under all of these, volatile financial markets, uncertainty basically everywhere about the economy and everything in between, gold was soaring. Copper was being liquidated because of the same monetary difficulties, the same deflationary monetary conditions. So the copper to gold ratio absolutely plunged, not reflecting inflation risk, nor reflecting higher interest rates, but deflationary conditions associated with everything else. The copper to gold ratio and swap spreads tend to move together because they're different things, different perceptions looking at the same thing and coming to the same conclusions. From the real economy as well as the monetary system, that's the real danger that Dalio was talking about, even if he wasn't quite right about the monetary aspects of it. But when it comes to recession risks, start there. At least we have rising probabilities of a full-blown, full-scale recession, going from the forgot how to grow variety of recession into the kind of recession that everyone recognizes when you use that term. So the risks of that are obviously rising. Even the stock market has picked up on that. We've talked about consumer confidence, which is a big one, because remember, consumer confidence is not about necessarily consumer spending. It can be about consumer spending if things continue to go in the wrong direction. But more often than not, consumer confidence is tied to perceptions of the labor market and incomes. And that's what consumers have said repeatedly over the last several months. And in survey after survey after survey, they are more afraid of losing their jobs, losing their incomes. And oh, by the way, if tariffs do raise prices, that will only leave them further behind than they were before. And so when it comes to consumers, it's been an absolute parade of horribles, to use the term from Delta Airlines CEO. The University of Michigan Consumer Confidence Index, as I noted yesterday, tumbled to the second lowest on record going back to 1952. Expectations down to where they were in the early 1980s. In fact, I think it was May 1980. People are increasingly concerned. The fear over losing their job or the perceptions of unemployment have soared in that survey, highest since the peak in 2009. So consumers are really worried about layoffs and losing their jobs. The data we got today from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in its survey of consumer expectations just reinforced all of these same fears, which means it's not one survey or another, it's all the surveys. And what that means is the chances of this being a real thing that consumers are picking up on is that much higher. So the probability of traditional recession continues to go way up. As far as price expectations, FRBNY's data showed that the one-year median price expectation among consumers was 3.58%. That's the highest since September 2023, which is consistent with consumers seeing prices likely to increase in the short run based on what's going to happen with tariffs. But they don't see prices staying that way. They're not seeing inflation. They're not even seeing anything more than a transitory impact from tariffs. The 3-year median price expectation was just 3%, exactly where it's been for 4 months straight. It's actually been lower than that last year, but right around 3% is consistent with the long-run average, long-run median for this series. So again, consumers are not seeing inflation. They're seeing a one-time price increase that is going to impact them negatively on top of everything else that they're afraid of. In fact, they know that tariffs are going to squeeze their employers, reduce their margins. We saw that already in consumer prices and producer prices, which then causes employers to say we need to cut costs in other places, which means jobs, layoffs, more than what we've seen so far in the forgot how to grow recession. And that's exactly what the FRBNY survey reported. The mean probability of losing a job soared to 15.68%, which is the same thing we saw in the Michigan survey. Just a huge increase in fears that layoffs are going to start pretty soon. And widespread layoffs are going to start pretty soon. But FRBNY also reported the mean probability U.S. unemployment rate will be higher a year from now absolutely surged to 44.04%. That's up 10 percentage points from January. Again, the artificial high, or during the artificial high, where people's expectations of unemployment declined with that artificial high in the economy. But at 44.04%, that's the highest since April and May of 2020. Not just the highest since April and May of 2020, it's one of the highest in the entire series. Household income expectations dipped down to a median of 2.8%, which is consistent with other indications showing that consumers are not just afraid that household income is going to fall off, that it actually is. We saw that in the personal income and spending statistics. Once you accounted for transfer payments and transfer receipts from the federal government to consumers. And job finding expectations, one I've been pointing out for the last couple of years, that one didn't budge either, because consumers understand, along with everything else we're talking about, at the very least, there has been no hiring. No one is out there hiring, and now there's fears and worries and legitimate concerns that in addition to no one hiring, maybe a lot of businesses are going to have to start firing. That's where you go from the forgot how to grow type of recession into the full-blown, full-scale one. And then you throw together some monetary difficulties that if they spill over widespread fashion, then you don't just have a garden variety full-blown recession. You've got that plus deflation and some of the worst possible cases. But as far as the labor market goes, consumers can feel it coming, and even students can sense that's happening too. As Bloomberg reported, it's a classic recession move. When the job market looks bleak, head to grad school. That's what happened after the global financial crisis, not financial crisis. And early signs here in 2025 suggest it could be happening again. Admissions consultants who guide students through applications, essays, and test prep say interest in grad school is climbing fast. Official numbers won't be out for months, but firms like Kaplan, Ivy Coach, Ivy Wise, Top Tier Admissions, and Cambridge Coaching all expect a big year. The number one influencer of students thinking about grad school is either an economic downturn or economic uncertainty. Students think that will be a good relaunch when the job market picks up. So they sit out grad school for a couple years and hope that whatever economic downturn happens, it will be better on the other side. It's a bit of a gamble, but you can understand where they're coming from, especially given all of these negatives that we keep seeing pop up and accelerate in place after place after place. But focus primarily on the macroeconomy side, focused on jobs and incomes. Fears about those continue to rise, and they rise in all of these different surveys. And the economic data that we keep getting, especially labor market data, aside from the establishment survey that's overstated, only reinforces these fears even more. So Ray Dalio says, look, we're already on the edge of recession, and there's a lot of people who agree with him, including people at CFO level and C-suite level who say the same thing. We can see the downside in the economy, not just emerging, but accelerating toward us. So you got the macroeconomic risks, and then on the other side of that, financial volatility, disruption, disorder, whatever you want to call it, that is all going back to certainly the Treasury market, the monetary side. It's not about higher interest rates. It's not about not being able to find somebody to buy U.S. government debt. In fact, it's the exact opposite. If the deflationary events actually do happen, then there'll be plenty of buyers for U.S. Treasuries, and that will be the problem. When you put together deflationary money and all the consequences that go with it, with a recession, it gets to some of the worst cases. And that's what Dalio was talking about. And he was right to talk about them because the probabilities are rising. They're not 100%. It's not definitely going to happen, but the probabilities are rising much more than we would like them to. So we're watching a couple things as we move forward here. First of all, on the money side, we're looking for the dollar to continue to be stronger, and it is stronger, it's not weaker. In those places where it is weaker, like the Swiss franc or the Japanese yen, they're going to tell us the same thing as if the dollar was rising, as it has been rising against other places and other currencies. Swap spreads, that's a big one. Swap rates too. As the conditions worsen in the marketplace, you see swap spreads continue to compress. They already got to be record lows that obliterated prior record lows, so we will continue to watch swap spreads to see where they're going. There's other bond markets that we could watch, like those in Germany that give us a curve that isn't subjected to the same types of specific treasury selling that we're getting in the treasury curve. So we can watch German markets and the German curves and how those change. Certainly no inflation or higher rates there as well. We also have to pay attention to collateral issues. So credit spreads, that's going to be a big one. Repo fails that have been relatively tame so far, as well as treasury bill rates and some other derivative indications that will tell us whether or not the monetary difficulties are accelerating as well. On the economic side, as always, labor and incomes. And consumer sentiment, as I keep pointing out, is tied to both of those, jobs and incomes. As perceptions of jobs and incomes continue to worsen, eventually the risk is that consumers say, we've had enough, we're starting to pull back. And we've seen a number of signs of that already. In terms of consumer credit, as well as the spending data, retail sales, personal income from the BEA. We've got all sorts of indications of the artificial high last year coming down into this payback period or this void. But either any way you look at it, there's rising recession risk, full-blown recession risk, on top of rising monetary risk and monetary difficulties in a way that the entire mainstream is actually at least talking about the symptom. So with those rising monetary difficulties and probabilities of maybe potentially worse deflationary monetary conditions, along with a growing possibility the forgot how to grow economy becomes remember how to recession, you put those two things together. Like I said, Ray Dalio is right to worry about them because the chances continue to grow, not lessen. And they're already too high to begin with. In the University of Michigan survey for consumers, it wasn't just that consumer confidence crashed, it was why it crashed. And Steve and I talked about that in the video link below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and Eurodollar University subscribers. And until next time, take care.